The evening sky turned deep purple as Alexander stood by the massive windows of his office. 60 floors up, he could see the entire city spread out before him like a glittering carpet. Lights blinked on one by one as darkness fell. This view had cost him millions, but money wasn't something Alexander thought about anymore, not when you had as much as he did. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Another day done. Another billion made. Another night alone. Alexander loosened his tie and checked his watch. A rare vintage piece worth more than most people's homes. Past 9 p.m. again. His assistant had left hours ago, along with everyone else on the executive floor. The cleaning staff would arrive soon. They were used to working around him during these late hours. "Sir?" A soft voice came through the intercom. "Your car is waiting." "Thank you, Rose," he replied, though his mind was elsewhere. The drive to his penthouse took 20 minutes. His driver, Thomas, knew better than to make small talk. Alexander spent the ride scrolling through emails on his phone, approving decisions that would affect thousands of employees worldwide. His company, Black Tech Industries, employed over 50,000 people across 5 continents. The latest quarterly report showed profits exceeding even the most optimistic projections. Success upon success, and nobody to share it with. The elevator to his penthouse required a special key and fingerprint scan. As the doors opened directly into his home, Alexander stepped into the vast, empty space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered the same spectacular view as his office, just from a different angle. Fine art hung on every wall, pieces from renowned galleries around the world. Yet one wall in his bedroom remained conspicuously bare. That's where Elena's favorite painting once hung. Alexander poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, a 30-year-old bottle, and walked to his study. A large photograph sat on his desk, the only personal item in the otherwise minimalist room. He picked it up, tracing the outline of Elena's face with his finger. Her bright smile. Those unforgettable amber eyes. The photo had been taken during their honeymoon in Greece 15 years ago. 3 months before she vanished without a trace. "Where did you go?" he whispered, the same question he'd asked countless times over the years. Their love story had been surprisingly normal for a man of his position. They'd met at an art gallery opening. He was there to discuss potential investments. She was the curator who'd organized the exhibition. Elena had challenged his opinions on modern art so boldly that he'd found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in years. By the end of the night, he'd asked her to dinner. She'd said no. Too busy, perhaps next week. Alexander hadn't been used to rejection. It made her all the more fascinating. When they finally did have dinner, 1 week turned into 3 months of dating, then a proposal on a cliffside in Santorini. Their wedding was intimate by billionaire standards. Only 200 guests. Elena had insisted on keeping things small. "I'm marrying you, not your bank account," she told him. For 3 years, life had been perfect. Then came that Tuesday in April. He'd returned from a business trip to find their apartment empty. No note. No warning. No argument beforehand. Just gone. Alexander set down his empty glass and opened his laptop. Email notifications flooded in, but he ignored them and opened a specific folder instead. Inside were files labeled by year and month, containing reports from the private investigators he still paid to search for her. 15 years of dead ends, possible sightings that led nowhere. The most recent report, like all the others, ended with the same conclusion: no new information to report. The police had initially suggested she'd left voluntarily. Friends claimed they saw no signs of trouble in the marriage. Eventually, as months stretched into years, even Alexander's most loyal employees stopped asking about her. But he never stopped looking. A calendar notification popped up on his screen. Annual Blackwood Foundation Gala. Tomorrow, 7 p.m., the foundation had been Elena's idea originally, using his technology and wealth to fund educational programs in underserved communities. After she disappeared, he'd thrown himself into expanding it, as if somehow keeping her dream alive might bring her back to him. Alexander closed his laptop and walked to the bedroom. Tomorrow would be another day of meetings, decisions, and the endless work of running his empire. The gala would be just another event: shake hands, make speeches, write checks. He didn't know that tomorrow would change everything. That across town, A young man with familiar amber eyes was preparing to attend that very gala. A young man who carried half his DNA and all the answers Alexander had spent 15 years searching for. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns mingled, their laughter mixing with the soft music played by the string quartet in the corner. Waiters glided between groups, offering champagne and tiny appetizers on silver trays. Alexander adjusted his bow tie as he stood near the entrance. He nodded at familiar faces, business partners, politicians, celebrities, all eager to be seen at the most exclusive charity event of the year. His assistant Rose hovered nearby, occasionally whispering names to remind him who was who. "The mayor just arrived with his wife," Rose murmured. "And the governor sends his regrets. Weather delayed his flight." Alexander nodded, his practiced smile never faltering. 15 years of hosting these galas had taught him how to perform his role perfectly: shake hands, compliment outfits, thank people for their generous donations. His personal feelings, the emptiness, the loneliness, stayed hidden behind his public mask. "It's time for your speech, sir," Rose said, guiding him toward the stage. The crowd quieted as Alexander took his place at the podium. Camera flashes popped around the room. He looked out at the sea of faces, many he recognized, some he didn't. His gaze swept across the room out of habit, always searching, always hoping. "Welcome to the 15th Annual Blackwood Foundation Gala," he began, his deep voice carrying across the ballroom without needing the microphone. "When we started this journey 15 years ago, we had a simple goal: to bring technology education to young people who might otherwise never have the opportunity." He paused, thinking of Elena. She had been the heart behind this foundation. Her passion had been the spark. Every year, saying these words without her felt wrong. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Blackwood Foundation has funded technology programs in over 500 schools worldwide. We've provided scholarships to more than 3,000 students. And tonight, with your help, we aim to double that impact in the coming year. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Charity made the wealthy feel good about themselves. Alexander knew the game well. He played his part in it. After finishing his speech and announcing the evening's fundraising goal, Alexander stepped down from the stage. Now came the part he dreaded most: socializing. He moved through the crowd, stopping for brief conversations, accepting congratulations on another successful year. "Mr. Blackwood, the foundation's work is truly inspiring," said an older woman dripping in diamonds. "My husband and I would like to pledge $1 million tonight." "Your generosity is appreciated," Alexander replied with a practiced smile. "I'll have someone from the foundation contact you tomorrow to arrange the details." As the woman moved away, Alexander glanced at his watch. He had given himself a 2-hour limit for these functions. Once that time passed, he would make a discreet exit, leaving the party to continue without him. Just 90 more minutes to go. He was reaching for a glass of water when he felt someone watching him. Alexander turned slightly and noticed a young man standing a few feet away. The young man seemed out of place among the wealthy crowd. His tuxedo was rented, not tailored, and he clutched his champagne glass too tightly. There was something oddly familiar about him, the way he stood, the shape of his face. Alexander couldn't place it, but it nagged at him. The young man caught Alexander's eye and took a deep breath. He approached with determination in his step. "Mr. Blackwood," the young man said, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hand. "I'm Ethan Parker. I've been hoping to meet you for some time." Up close, Alexander froze. The young man's eyes, amber with distinct golden flecks, were hauntingly familiar. He had seen those exact eyes every day for 3 years of marriage. He had dreamed about those eyes for 15 years since. Elena's eyes. "I'm sorry to approach you like this," Ethan continued, unaware of Alexander's shock. "I know this is hardly the place, but I've tried contacting your office for months." Alexander found his voice with difficulty. "What can I do for you, Mr. Parker?" Ethan glanced around nervously. "This isn't a conversation we should have in public, but I believe I'm your son." The room seemed to tilt. The chattering crowd, the music, the clinking glasses, everything faded to background noise. Alexander stared at the young man, truly seeing him now. The jawline that matched his own, the way he held himself, And those eyes. Elena's eyes in a face that echoed his own younger self. "How old are you?" Alexander asked, his voice barely audible. 22, Ethan replied. "I was born after my mother left." 22 years. The math fit perfectly. Elena had been gone 15 years. She must have been pregnant when she disappeared. "Your mother," Alexander said carefully, "is she?" "That's the other reason I'm here," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "My mother is missing. She disappeared 6 months ago, and I need your help to find her." The security team noticed the intensity of their conversation and started moving toward them. Alexander held up a hand to wave them off. For the first time in 15 years, he felt something break through the numbness. A chaotic mix of shock, anger, hope, and a strange, unexpected joy. "We need to talk," Alexander said, guiding Ethan toward a private room off the main ballroom. Now, Alexander closed the door of the private meeting room behind them. The sounds of the gala, the music, the chatter, the clinking glasses, faded to a distant hum. The room, normally used for business meetings, felt too formal for this moment. 2 leather couches faced each other across a glass coffee table. A large painting of the city's skyline hung on one wall. "Please sit," Alexander said, gesturing to one of the couches. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This young man claimed to be his son, a son he never knew existed. Ethan sat down stiffly, perched on the edge of the couch like he might need to run at any moment. "I know this is a shock," he said. "It's not how I planned to tell you." Alexander remained standing, unable to keep still. "You said your name is Ethan Parker. Parker wasn't your mother's last name." "She changed it after she left," Ethan explained. "We moved around a lot when I was growing up. She used different names sometimes, for work," she said. Alexander studied the young man's face, looking for proof, for connection. The resemblance was there, not just Elena's eyes, but other features too. The shape of his forehead, the way he gestured with his hands when he spoke. "Tell me everything," Alexander said, finally sitting down across from Ethan. "Start from the beginning." Ethan took a deep breath. "My mom raised me on her own. We never stayed in one place for more than a couple years. She worked as an art consultant for different galleries. She was good at it, had a real eye for spotting talented artists." Alexander nodded. That sounded like Elena. Her talent for discovering new artists had been what made her such a successful curator. "She never said anything bad about you," Ethan continued. "When I asked about my father, she just said he was a good man who didn't know I existed. She kept old newspapers with your picture in them, hidden in a box under her bed. That's how I found out who you were." "And she never told you why she left?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with emotion. Ethan shook his head. "She always changed the subject, said it was complicated and that someday she'd explain everything. But then, she disappeared," Alexander finished for him. 6 months ago, Ethan confirmed. "She got a phone call one night. I only heard her say, 'How did you find me?' She looked scared. The next morning, she was gone. Just left a note saying she had to take care of something and would contact me when it was safe." Alexander stood up again, pacing the room. "And you've heard nothing since then?" "Nothing." Ethan's voice cracked. "I waited 2 months before I started looking for you. I thought you might know something, or at least have the resources to help find her." Alexander stopped pacing. "Ethan, I've been looking for your mother for 15 years. I hired the best private investigators, spent millions. Nobody ever found any trace of her." The room fell silent. Alexander looked at the young man, his son, and felt doubt creeping in. This could be an elaborate con. People had tried to take advantage of his wealth before, claiming all sorts of connections. "I understand if you don't believe me," Ethan said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I wouldn't believe me either. That's why I brought this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. From it, he removed a folded piece of paper and handed it to Alexander. It was a birth certificate. Ethan Michael Parker, born 7 months after Elena disappeared. Mother, Elena Parker. Father, unlisted. "And this," Ethan added, pulling a small photograph from his wallet. The photo showed Elena holding a baby. She looked different. Her hair shorter, dyed a darker color, but her smile was the same. The picture was time-stamped from 22 years ago. Alexander felt his legs grow weak. He sat down heavily on the couch. "I'm not asking for money," Ethan said quickly. "I just want to find my mom." "Our mom?" Alexander looked up at him, seeing now what he should have noticed immediately. This young man had his determination, his intensity, and Elena's kindness in his eyes. "I need to be certain," Alexander said. "I hope you understand." Ethan nodded. "DNA test. I figured you'd want that. I'm ready whenever you are." Alexander pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Dr. Chen. I need a favor. Tonight?" "Yes, it's important." "Thank you." He hung up and looked at Ethan. "My personal physician will meet us at my penthouse in an hour. He can take samples from both of us. We'll have preliminary results by morning." Ethan exhaled slowly. "That fast?" "When you can afford the best labs, things happen quickly," Alexander said. He studied the young man again, this time allowing himself to see the possibility. If Ethan was telling the truth, if he really was Alexander's son, then everything would change. "While we wait for those results," Alexander said, "tell me about yourself. 22 years. I've missed so much." As Ethan began to talk about his life, growing up moving from city to city, his college scholarship for computer science, his current job at a tech startup, Alexander listened with growing certainty. The way Ethan described solving problems, his interest in technology, his quiet confidence, it was like hearing a younger version of himself. By the time they left the gala through a back entrance to avoid the press, Alexander knew in his heart what the DNA test would confirm. This was his son, Elena's son, the family he thought he'd lost forever. And now, Elena was missing again. But this time, he wasn't searching alone. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse. He hadn't slept all night. How could he? His world had been turned upside down in less than 24 hours. He stood in his kitchen, coffee cup in hand, watching Ethan sleep on the living room couch. The young man had been exhausted after their long conversation, but Alexander's mind wouldn't let him rest. He'd spent the night going through old photos of Elena, seeing the similarities between mother and son that he'd missed at first glance. His phone buzzed on the counter. Dr. Chen's number. "Yes." Alexander answered quietly, moving toward his office so he wouldn't wake Ethan. "The preliminary results are in," Dr. Chen said. "I rushed them as you asked. The paternity match is positive 99.9% certainty. He's definitely your son, Mr. Blackwood." Alexander closed his eyes. Even though he'd already begun to believe it, hearing scientific confirmation hit him hard. "Thank you, doctor." He hung up and leaned against his desk, emotions washing over him in waves. Joy at finding a son he never knew he had. Anger that Elena had kept this secret from him. Confusion about why she'd left in the first place. And underneath it all, fear for her safety now. A soft knock on the doorframe pulled him from his thoughts. Ethan stood there, his hair rumpled from sleep, looking young and uncertain. "I heard your phone," he said. "Was that the doctor?" Alexander nodded. "The test confirmed it. You're my son." Something shifted in Ethan's face, relief, maybe, or vindication. "I knew it," he said softly. "Mom never lied to me about important things." "Then why did she lie to me?" Alexander asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Why didn't she tell me she was pregnant? Why disappear without a word?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. But she must have had a good reason. She always talked about you with respect. Even kept those newspaper clippings of your success." Alexander sighed and gestured toward the kitchen. "Let's have some breakfast. Then we need to talk about finding your mother." "Our mother," he corrected himself, the words strange on his tongue. Over eggs and toast, Alexander asked Ethan to tell him everything about Elena's disappearance. Every detail might matter. "She got that phone call around 9 p.m., Ethan recalled. "I was in my room working on a coding project. I heard her voice change, get all tense and quiet. When I came out, she was pale, like she'd seen a ghost." "What exactly did she say?" Alexander pressed. "Just that line I told you. How did you find me?" Then she switched to speaking really quietly. I couldn't hear the rest. And the next morning, she was gone. Left a note saying she had to take care of something from her past and would contact me when it was safe. Told me not to look for her or call the police. Alexander frowned. But you did look for her. Not right away, Ethan admitted. Mom and I had a system. If either of us needed to leave suddenly, we'd wait 2 months before raising an alarm. It was something she taught me growing up, said it was just a safety precaution. That's not normal, Alexander said, setting down his coffee cup. Most families don't have systems for disappearing. I know that now. But when you grow up with something, it just seems normal, you know? Ethan pushed his eggs around his plate. After 2 months with no word, I checked her things. That's when I found the box with your pictures and realized who you were. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, thinking, we need to pull together everything we know, my resources, your knowledge of her recent life. Maybe together we can find the pieces I've been missing for 15 years. He turned back to Ethan. I have a team of investigators who've been looking for her on and off since she disappeared. They're the best in the business. But they never had the advantage of knowing about you or the places you lived. Ethan nodded. I have addresses, names she used, friends she had in different cities. I kept track of everything after she disappeared, hoping to find a pattern. Smart, Alexander said, feeling a strange burst of pride. That's exactly what we need. He walked to his home office, Ethan following behind. Inside, Alexander went to a painting on the wall, a small, modest landscape unlike the valuable artwork in the rest of the penthouse. He swung the painting aside to reveal a wall safe. This is everything I've collected over 15 years, he said, opening the safe and pulling out a thick folder. Every lead, every report, every possible sighting. He placed the folder on his desk and looked at Ethan. Now we combine what we know. They spent the next several hours creating a timeline on the glass wall of Alexander's office using special markers that wiped clean. Dates, cities, names, everything they knew about Elena's movements over the past 22 years. Patterns began to emerge. Ethan noticed they never stayed near major ports or border cities. Alexander realized she often worked at galleries with connections to the same art dealer network. This gallery in Toronto, Alexander said, pointing to a name on their timeline, and this one in Vancouver 3 years later, and here in Chicago after that. They're all linked to Vincent Keller. Who's that? Ethan asked. Alexander's expression darkened. Vincent Keller owned the gallery where your mother worked when I met her. He wasn't happy when she left to start her own consulting business. I always thought he seemed too interested in her. Ethan frowned, adding the name to their chart. You think he might be involved somehow? I don't know, Alexander admitted, but it's the first real connection we've found. And after 22 years in business, I know one thing for certain. What's that? There's no such thing as coincidence. Alexander picked up his phone. I need to make some calls. We're going to find out everything there is to know about Vincent Keller and his gallery network. For the first time in 15 years, Alexander felt a spark of real hope. With his resources and Ethan's knowledge, they had a fighting chance of solving the mystery that had haunted them both. And somewhere out there, Elena needed them to hurry. 3 days had passed since Alexander's world changed forever. His spacious penthouse, once silent and empty, now buzzed with activity. The glass wall in his office was covered with photos, maps, and sticky notes. Laptops and tablets littered every surface. 2 of his best security team members had moved in temporarily, along with his top private investigator. And then there was Ethan, his son. Alexander still found himself staring sometimes, noticing another similarity, another gesture or expression that reminded him of himself or Elena. We've got something, called Raj, Alexander's head of security, from where he sat hunched over a laptop. Everyone gathered around him. Keller Gallery financial records, Raj explained, pointing to his screen. Your contacts at the bank really came through, boss. Alexander nodded. Having friends in high places meant sometimes bending rules for good reasons. What did you find? Large cash deposits followed by wire transfers to offshore accounts, Raj said. Classic money laundering pattern. But here's the interesting part. The deposits always happened right after major art sales. Ethan leaned in. Art forgery? Lisa, the private investigator who had been searching for Elena longer than anyone, nodded approvingly. Smart kid. Art is perfect for laundering money. Hard to verify, subjective in value, easy to transport across borders. But what does this have to do with my mother? Ethan asked. Alexander studied the financial records. Elena was Keller's chief curator. She authenticated paintings, verified their provenance, their history. If he was selling forgeries, she would have known, Ethan finished. She had an amazing eye for detail. She could spot a fake from across the room, she always said. Lisa pulled up another file on her tablet. According to my sources, 3 months before Elena disappeared, Keller Gallery sold a rediscovered painting supposedly by Thomas Wilson, the American painter. Sold for $8 million to a private collector. I remember that, Alexander said. Elena was excited about the discovery. She'd found it in an old estate sale, authenticated it herself. Well, guess what? Lisa swiped her screen to show a news article. The collector had it re-authenticated last year. It's a fake. A very good fake, but definitely not a Wilson. The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. You think Keller was knowingly selling forgeries, Alexander said slowly, and Elena found out. Not just Keller, Lisa said. Look at these names. Buyers, sellers, other galleries in his network. Some very powerful people who wouldn't want to be connected to fraud. Alexander turned to Ethan. You said your mother taught you to be ready to disappear at any moment, that you had a system. Ethan nodded. She always said it was just a precaution. She was protecting you, Alexander realized. She discovered the forgery operation, and when they'd found out she knew. They threatened her, Ethan said quietly. Or us, so she ran. Alexander felt a cold anger building inside him. For 15 years, he'd imagined every possible reason Elena might have left. Another man, a secret life, unhappiness he'd somehow missed. Never once had he considered she might have left to protect him. But why not tell me, he asked, the question that had haunted him for years. I could have helped. I had resources, connections. Lisa shook her head. These people wouldn't hesitate to go after you too. And back then, you were just starting to build your company. You weren't as powerful as you are now. And she was pregnant, Ethan added softly. She had more than just herself to worry about. Alexander rubbed his face, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Elena had sacrificed everything, their marriage, their life together, to keep him and their unborn child safe. So what changed 6 months ago? He asked, refocusing on the present. Why did they find her now, after all these years? Raj clicked through more files on his laptop. The fake Wilson painting being discovered might have started people asking questions. Old players getting nervous about exposure. Or new players cleaning house, Lisa suggested. Art forgery networks often change hands. New boss wants to tie up loose ends. Alexander moved to the window, looking out at the city as he thought. We need to know who has her now. Keller? I've had him under surveillance since yesterday, Lisa said. His movements don't suggest he's holding anyone. He seems nervous, actually, looking over his shoulder a lot. What about properties? Alexander asked. Storage facilities, remote locations, anywhere they could hold someone. Working on it, Raj said. We've identified 3 possible locations owned by shell companies linked to Keller's associates. Alexander turned back to the room, decision made. We'll check them all, starting tonight. Wait, Ethan stood up. You're not suggesting we break into these places ourselves. Alexander's expression was grim. I've spent 15 years playing by the rules, Ethan. Filing reports, hiring investigators, following legal channels. And I got nowhere. He looked around at his team, then back to his son. These people took your mother from us once. Then they found her again and took her from you. I'm not waiting any longer. This isn't like hacking a competitor's system or outmaneuvering a rival CEO, Ethan argued. These people are dangerous. So am I, Alexander said quietly, when it comes to protecting the people I love. The words hung in the air. It was the first time he'd come close to expressing the emotions churning inside him since Ethan had entered his life. Ethan held his father's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not, Alexander replied immediately. It's too dangerous. She's my mother, Ethan said firmly. I've been protecting her and she's been protecting me my whole life. I'm not stopping now. Alexander recognized the determined set of Ethan's jaw. It was the same expression he saw in the mirror when he'd made up his mind about something. "He's got your stubborn streak," Lisa observed with a slight smile. Alexander sighed, seeing he wouldn't win this argument. "Fine, but you stay with me at all times and follow my instructions exactly." As the team began preparing equipment and reviewing building layouts, Alexander felt a strange sense of clarity. For 15 years, he'd been living in limbo, unable to move forward, always searching for answers. Now finally he had a son, a purpose, and a plan. He was going to bring Elena home. Rain pattered against the windows of the SUV as it moved quietly through the night. Alexander checked his watch, 2:18 a.m. The perfect time for what they were about to do. Most people would be asleep, security would be at its most relaxed. "Are you sure about this location?" he asked Raj, who was driving with practiced calm. "It's our best lead," Raj replied. "The warehouse is owned by a shell company that traces back to one of Keller's known associates. Power usage spiked 3 months ago and has remained high ever since. Someone's using it for something." In the back seat, Ethan fidgeted with the edge of his bulletproof vest. Alexander had insisted everyone wear one, though he hoped they wouldn't be necessary. "Remember the plan," Alexander said, turning to look at his son. "You stay with Lisa at the surveillance point. Raj and I, along with the team, will handle the entry." Ethan nodded reluctantly. He'd wanted to be part of the main team, but had eventually agreed to stay back after hours of argument. The compromise was that he would monitor the building's security cameras once their tech specialist hacked in. The SUV turned down a quiet industrial street lined with warehouses. Most were dark and silent, but one in the middle had a single light visible near what appeared to be an office area. "That's it," Raj said, pointing. He drove past without slowing and turned down an alley 2 buildings away. The team assembled quickly and silently. Besides Alexander, Raj, and Ethan, there were 4 others, all former military or law enforcement, who now worked for Alexander's private security company. They moved with quiet efficiency, checking equipment and communications. "Comms check," Raj said softly, and each person responded in turn. Thomas in position came the voice of their tech specialist, who had positioned himself earlier to hack into the warehouse's security system. "I've got access to their cameras," Thomas continued. 2 guards at the main entrance, 1 patrolling the perimeter. And wait, I'm seeing a separate room in the back with its own guard. Could be where they're keeping her." Alexander's heart raced. After 15 years of searching, Elena might be just 100 yards away. "Send the feed to Ethan's tablet," he ordered. "Ethan, you watch those cameras. If anything changes, anything at all, you let us know immediately." Ethan nodded, eyes serious. "Be careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander squeezed his son's shoulder. "I will. We're going to bring her home." The rain provided perfect cover as the team moved silently toward the warehouse. Thomas had disabled the exterior alarms, allowing them to approach a side entrance undetected. "Patrol guard is on the opposite side." Ethan's voice came through their earpieces. "You've got about 3 minutes before he circles back around." Alexander nodded to Raj, who quickly picked the lock on the side door. Seconds later, they were inside. The warehouse was mostly empty, with a few crates stacked near the walls. The team moved in practiced formation toward the back, where Thomas had identified the guarded room. "Guard at the target door is still there," Ethan warned. Armed. Raj signaled 2 team members to flank the hallway leading to the room. Alexander stayed close behind, heart pounding in his chest. It happened fast. The guard never had a chance to raise his weapon before Raj's team had him subdued and unconscious. "Clear," Raj whispered into his comm. Alexander moved forward, staring at the heavy door. A keypad lock secured it. "Thomas, we need the code," he said urgently. "Working on it," Thomas replied. "It's a 6-digit code. Trying to override." "Wait," Alexander said, studying the keypad. Some of the numbers were more worn than others. "Try 7 to 49 to 30 to 2. "How did you?" Thomas began. "Elena's birthday and mine. July 4th and September 30th. There was a pause as Thomas input the code. The lock clicked open. "It worked," Thomas said, sounding impressed. Alexander took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, with a bed, a chair, and a small bathroom visible through an open door. Sitting on the bed, her back to the door, was a woman with graying dark hair. She turned at the sound of the door, and Alexander's world stopped. 15 years older, thinner, lines of worry etched around her eyes and mouth, but unmistakably Elena. Her eyes widened in shock. "Alexander," she whispered, as if not believing what she was seeing. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking. After 15 years of imagining this moment, he found himself frozen, unable to move. She stood slowly, one hand braced against the wall as if she might fall. "How did you find me? You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "I know everything," Alexander said, finding his voice again. "About Keller, the forgeries, why you left." Her face crumpled. "I never wanted to leave you. You have to believe that. But they threatened to kill you if I didn't disappear." "Boss, we need to move," Raj said from the doorway. Patrol guard just called in for backup when he found his colleagues down. Alexander extended his hand to Elena. "We need to go. Now." She hesitated. "Alexander, there's something you don't know. Something I never told you." "If it's about our son, I know," he said softly. "Ethan found me. He's waiting for us right now." Tears filled Elena's eyes. "Ethan is here? He's with you?" "Yes, and he's been looking for you as hard as I've been looking for both of you all these years." Her expression changed from shock to determination. She took his outstretched hand. "Then let's go." They moved quickly through the warehouse, Raj's team providing cover. As they neared the exit, shouting erupted from the front of the building. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "We've got company," Raj warned. "Move faster." They'd burst through the side door into the rain, running toward the alley where Lisa waited with Ethan. Gunshots rang out behind them, but they kept running. Elena stumbled once, and Alexander caught her, lifting her almost off her feet as they continued forward. They turned the corner into the alley, and there was Ethan, his face lighting up as he saw his mother. "Mom," he cried, running toward them. Elena broke free from Alexander and threw her arms around her son, sobbing. "Ethan, oh my God, Ethan." Alexander watched them, his heart so full it threatened to burst. But there was no time for reunions yet. "Into the car. Now," he ordered as more shouts came from behind them. They'd piled into the waiting SUV, Lisa already in the driver's seat with the engine running. As they sped away into the rainy night, Elena sat between Alexander and Ethan, holding tightly to both of them. "I never thought I'd see you both together," she whispered. "I never dared hope for this." Alexander looked over her head at his son, seeing his own joy reflected in Ethan's eyes. Against all odds, their family was whole again. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Alexander's lake house, painting golden patterns on the wooden floor. 6 weeks had passed since the night they'd rescued Elena. 6 weeks of adjustments, explanations, and healing. Alexander stood on the back deck, watching Elena and Ethan walking along the shoreline. They moved with the same graceful gait, heads tilted at identical angles as they talked. The sight still amazed him, his family together at last. The lake house had been Alexander's secret retreat for years, known to only his most trusted staff. Far from the city, surrounded by acres of private forest, it offered the safety and privacy they desperately needed while they figured out their next steps. Elena looked up and saw him watching. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, unlike the cautious ones from those first tense days after the rescue. She waved, and Alexander waved back, his heart still skipping a beat whenever she looked at him. 15 years apart hadn't changed that. Inside the house, phones rang. Not Alexander's personal line, but one of the many secured lines his security team had set up. News about the Keller investigation, most likely. He stepped inside to answer it. "Yes." "It's done," Raj said from the other end. "The FBI just arrested Keller and 3 of his associates. International warrants are out for the rest." "And the evidence?" Alexander asked. "Rock solid. The files Elena collected all those years ago, combined with the new evidence we gathered, they don't stand a chance. The prosecutor says they're looking at 20 years minimum." "Good," Alexander said simply. He thought of all the years stolen from his family by Keller's threats. 20 years seemed too light a sentence. He hung up as Elena and Ethan came through the back door, cheeks flushed from the crisp autumn air. "News?" Elena asked, reading his expression. "They arrested Keller. It's over." Elena closed her eyes briefly, years of tension visibly draining from her shoulders. Really over? Really over, Alexander confirmed. Your evidence was the key. All those records you kept, the photos of forged paintings, the financial documents, you built a case against them even while you were running. Ethan put his arm around his mother's shoulders. See? I told you we'd get them. Elena leaned into her son's embrace, then looked at Alexander. What happens now? It was the question they'd all been avoiding. What happened now that the danger was gone? What did their future look like after 15 years apart? Alexander hesitated. That's up to us to decide. Together. That evening, they sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and pink. The peaceful scene was a far cry from the chaos of the warehouse rescue or the frantic days that followed when they'd had to stay hidden while building their case against Keller. I never stopped looking for you, Alexander said softly to Elena. 15 years, and I never gave up. I wanted to contact you so many times, she replied. Especially when Ethan was growing up. He'd do something that reminded me so much of you, and I'd pick up the phone, but I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk them hurting either of you. Ethan looked between his parents. So what now? Do we just become a normal family? Is that even possible? Alexander laughed lightly. I don't think normal is in the cards for us. But family, yes, that's possible. Elena reached out, taking Alexander's hand in her left and Ethan's in her right. I spent 22 years looking over my shoulder, moving from place to place. I don't even know what a permanent home feels like anymore. Then we'll figure it out together, Alexander said. My penthouse never felt like a home anyway. Too empty. Too cold. Maybe it's time for something new. I've got my job at the tech startup, Ethan said. It's in the city, but I could commute. And I could consult for legitimate galleries again, Elena added. I've missed the art world, the real art world, not the forgery business. Alexander watched them making plans, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. The emptiness that had hollowed him out was filling, piece by piece. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Alexander found Elena standing by the large windows, looking up at the stars. You could have built a new life, she said without turning around. Found someone else. Been happy. I tried. Alexander admitted, moving to stand beside her. Nothing ever felt right. No one was you. She turned to face him. We're different people now. It's been 15 years. I know, he said. I'm not expecting us to pick up where we left off, but I'd like the chance to know who you are now. And maybe see if there's still something there. Elena's eyes, those amber eyes that had haunted his dreams for 15 years, searched his face. There's always been something there, Alexander. Why do you think I kept all those newspaper clippings? Why do you think I told Ethan about you his whole life? Slowly, cautiously, Alexander reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, familiar yet new. We have time now, he said. No more running. No more looking over our shoulders. Elena smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Time. That's all I ever wanted. Time with my son. Time with you. Then that's what we'll have, Alexander promised. Outside, the stars shimmered over the lake. Inside, a family broken by circumstances beyond their control began the delicate, beautiful work of becoming whole again. It wouldn't be easy. There would be awkward moments, disagreements, adjustments as they learned to live together after so long apart. But for the first time in 15 years, Alexander's vast fortune finally felt like wealth, real wealth, the kind money could never buy.